listening to the Chase Merrill podcast.
Yeah. As somebody who prepared for this podcast by eating, I just got done eating a pound of grass-fed, grass-finished ground beef. I threw some raw cheese on there. And then this is where I differed or deviated. I also had some bananas fried up in the tallow and some pickles and a kiwi. Why is it, in your opinion, that something that should be so objective, like everybody's always like trust the science or listen to the science, but you could listen to the science from one side and from one and then the exact opposite from the other? Why is it so divisive on something that you would hope would be so just black and white?
Well, because I mean, the science is a fallacy. Science is a method of discovery and intrigue. So, the scientific method is a systematic approach to discerning what is happening in reality. And so, that's used as a propaganda tool to say you have to listen to me, and if you don't, then you're a science denier and a crazy person. And that's nonsense. Any real scientist understands that there will always be differing opinions. There will always be different points of views, even with the same facts. And even if people agree on the same facts, they can differ in their interpretation of those facts. There was a Nobel Prize winner named Ivor Giver, sorry. And he was a Nobel Prize winner in physics. He worked with superconductors and semiconductors and things like that. And he actually quit his seat at the American Physical Society because they were very dogmatic about certain things, and they said, "No, this is the science, and no one can disagree, and you have to whatever." And he said, "Well, hold on a second. You guys are still arguing over the weight of a proton. If you can still argue over the objective weight of the smallest piece of stable matter in existence that we know of, then anything's up for debate." And in that he was talking about large systems with complex interplay and things like that. He's like, hold on a second, no, I mean that this is a huge complex discussion. You can't say no, this is settled, because it's not. Nothing is settled. So this is a method. It's a tool to use, a tool of discovery. And so, anybody who says you have to trust the science, is probably just trying to mislead you. I think nutrition is very simple. There is objectively an optimal diet for all living beings. Even just all life on Earth. Bacteria have specific bacteria have a specific set of nutritional needs and goals that they have to obtain, or else they'll die out. They won't be able to procreate, and that's it. They're gone. Plants, trees, butterflies, everything has a specific set of nutritional requirements that they have to have, and other things that will A, not meet those requirements, and B, could cause harm. And the same thing goes for human beings. And so if you look at what a monarch butterfly eats, you don't need a survey of 70,000 nurses every 4 years to guess about what their monarch butterfly ate, every 4 years. You just like, look, what the hell does a monarch butterfly eat? And what do they eat in nature? Are they healthy? What if they eat something else? Oh, they're not healthy. Okay, that's interesting. Well, how do we know what to feed animals in the zoo? We see what they eat in nature. We see what they've been eating for the longest period of time as a population. And we see that they're healthy doing that. Okay, well, what do humans eat in the wild? What do we eat in nature? Well, up until very recently, with the advent of agriculture, it was predominantly meat. What were people eating in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages? We know humans existed and thrived in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages. We know that they crossed the land bridge from Asia to North America during the ice ages, when there was, the sea levels were so far down that there was this ice bridge that you could walk across from Asia to North America. And what exactly is going to be available to eat in those conditions? It's going to be fish, marine life, and the things that prey upon marine life and that come back out onto land. and the things that prey upon them, and then possibly migratory animals coming through those icy areas to get to greener pastures on the other side. That's what you'd have. And that would be animals, right? So we know that humans have been apex predators for literally over 2 million years. Apex predators predominantly eat meat. That's the definition in terms. You're not only a predator, you are an apex predator. You eat basically everything below you. And we're not only apex predators, we're called super predators because we routinely hunt and eat more other apex predators, than any other apex predator. An apex predator doesn't mean that it never gets killed by anything ever. It just means that it doesn't have any natural predators. You know, like a seal or a sea lion is a fantastic predator. It's eating all sorts of stuff, but it's not apex because great white sharks and orcas are their natural predator. We don't have natural predators. We make other predators our prey. We've hunted every single animal and been able to hunt every single animal on the land, sea, and air going back millions of years. And, you know, in the air, at least tens of thousands of years with the advent of the bow and arrow. And the sling and things like that. So that's pretty easy. You know, when you see what humans eat in nature, see what the Inuit eat in nature, you see what the Native Americans eat in nature, you see what the Maasai eat in nature, and how healthy they are. And you line that up with, well, we've been eating that way for millions of years, and they don't have any of the chronic diseases that we face nowadays. And when those genetic populations stop eating what they traditionally eat and start eating a Western diet, a post-agricultural diet, they do get all the illnesses that we get. And then they stop eating it and go back to where they ate normally, and it goes away. That happens in Australia right now. I work with a number of people. Some of them are work with the indigenous population of the Australian Aboriginals, and they know that these Western diseases basically come from Western society and Western cultures. And if you're in the city and you're exposing yourself to city things like the food, alcohol, etc., they get sick. And eventually, and they know that if to get away from this, you go back into the bush and live with your relatives out in the country, and you just start, hunting, fishing, and living out in nature, and just the problem goes away. And so there's a reversible nature to this as well. This is well documented in anthropology textbooks. This is not my opinion. This is a fact. And so it's not about trusting the science. This is just a fact. This is a phenomenon that has been observed and documented, that when pre-agricultural populations are living in their natural state of being, is they do not get the chronic diseases that we face as a mainstay in modern civilization. And it's not until they transition over to a post-agricultural way of living, by food coming into their areas or them going into the cities, that they then start displaying these health issues, these chronic diseases that we face. That becomes the majority of illnesses they have, whereas before it's injuries, infectious disease, childbirth, delivery sort of things. And it's not because they don't live long enough. I mean, there's people in their 20s and even teens having heart attacks and strokes now. So it's not that. And we also know, is again in all modern anthropology textbooks and papers, that pre-agricultural societies, when they die of old age, they live as long or longer than people in Western societies. They have a higher infant mortality rate. And so that lowers their average life expectancy from birth. But life expectancy from birth is a really bad metric. And it's only recently that we started using that more often because our own infant mortality rate sharply declined within the last century. But in the 1800s, it was extremely high. And so the average life expectancy from birth in America in 1850 was 38. But the average life expectancy from age 10 was 58, right? So it's a big jump, And so you look at the Inuit, look at the Maasai, and they say, wow, their life expectancy is only 60 years. No, that's from birth because they have a high infant mortality rate. And either way, 60 is well old enough to get diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, but they don't get it. And they're not dying from that. I mean, that's the thing that people that people try to conflate. They're, oh, well, they die at 60. Okay, so were they dying of heart disease and diabetes and cancer? Well, no, they don't get that. Well, then what the fuck is your point? Like, I mean, it's like, what's wrong with you? Like, it has nothing to do with it. But if they're dying and getting killed by wild animals and things like that, yeah, average life expectancy from birth goes down. It has nothing to do with it. It's a moot point, because when they die of old age, they die much older than we do, and they don't die of chronic diseases. They just run out of time. And so it's very easy. You just look at what humans eat. And what humans eat is certainly not anything that comes in a box or a packet or something that was only invented in the last century. We know that for sure.
Just give me one quick moment, then we'll be right back to the episode. If you are enjoying the show, go ahead and give me a follow or subscribe wherever you are listening. It helps way more than you'd think. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating or a review, that helps new people find the show as well. And if you have any questions or comments or recommendations for guests, go ahead and reach out to me at Chaffee Merrill on Instagram, or leave a comment right here on Spotify. Thank you so much for being here. Now let's get back to the episode. In the book Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind or whatever, phenomenal book, but he talks about like how with the advent of agriculture, how the quality of life in the individual human drastically decreased, while the benefit to society increased just due to like the population increase that they were able to sustain. But the individual quality of life decreased because they had to actively stay in the one place. They had to actively farm and protect their crops, and it was a much more rigorous activity, but also the quality of their diet went down as well, due to the fact that they went from eating, animals and a wide array of things to this specific crop that they were growing at that time. Would you say you've been carnivore? I believe just straight carnivore, like nothing else, right?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
With the consumption of your carnivore diet as is, would you say that we adapted to eat, in addition to mainly meats, other things as well? Like we were supplementing them at the time when we couldn't get those animals, when we couldn't find them, or it was time of famine?
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, the thing is that we come from an herbivorous background, and that's something. Oh, we were eating all this other stuff. That was 8 million years ago. So it was a long time ago. About 2.5 million years ago, our early ancestors, Homo habilis, became apex predators, and that was how they survived because of the advent of the ice ages. When the ice shelf started coming down, there weren't polar ice caps before 2.5 million years ago, and then they started coming down. We're actually in an ice age still. It's just sort of ebbs and flows of that ice age. Prior to that, there was no polar ice cap for hundreds of millions of years, they believe. And so when that started, a lot of the early humans, proto-humans, who were reliant more on plants, they all died out. They couldn't survive. The ones that survived, our ancestors, were the ones that were able to survive as pure carnivores, as apex predators, and be very dominant, using tools and tactics and things like that to take down animals that outclassed us by every physical metric. I mean, just read Moby Dick and understand just how weak we are compared to these things, and yet we are prevailing against these things from group hunting tactics, and technology. Right now, it's a lot easier to take these things out, but we were doing it with spears and rocks, and even just scaring things over a cliff for millions of years. Um, so we do have some residual adaptations from that period, but a lot of that has gone away. And animals and plants are in sort of an evolutionary arms race. This was taught to me in 7th grade biology, that animals and plants are in an evolutionary arms race. Plants becoming more and more toxic, so less and less animals can eat them, so they can survive and thrive. And animals are becoming more and more adapted to specific poisons and specific plants, so they can eat that plant, become hyper specialized, and survive and thrive. When you step out of that arms race, it goes on without you. And so we stepped out of that about 2 million years ago, and would have lost many of the innate abilities that we had to break down certain toxins. We certainly lost the ability to break down fiber because we lost our cecum. It's now an appendix. It's a vestigial cecum. It may still have a use. I'm sure it does, but what it doesn't do is break down fiber, which is what it did millions of years ago. It was 5-foot long cecum that had a blind end, and fiber would pack in and ferment and break down into saturated fat and proteins. And we don't do that anymore. So we lost that ability. We likely lost others, and we stepped out of that arms race. So about 10,000 years ago, certain populations stepped back into that arms race, but we did not have the innate capacity to deal with those toxins. And so it was only through innovation and technology and intelligence that people could figure out how to mix things together to neutralize the toxins, how to cook them or add acids or bases or other sorts of chemicals to them, or ferment them in order to break down those toxins and say, hey, if you do this like this, we can survive on it, right? So that took a lot of ingenuity, and it was only through technology and our ability to learn that we figured that out. And we figured out how to survive on plants to lower their toxic load and increase the bioavailability of those nutrients, because that's another way that plants defend themselves, is by locking out the the nutrients that are inherent in the plant. And so it may have all the calcium, iron, and whatever that you could want, but if it's bound up in chemical bonds that you don't have enzymes to break down, it's no good to you. And that's further proof that we are not biologically designed to eat these plants, right? Because we
fruit.
don't. Fruit, same thing. I mean,
Same thing.
there's a ton of nutrients that we just don't have access to, and fruit do have toxins. It's just that sweet fruit in particular seem to have less toxins that are toxic to us, but grapes are sweet.
Mm-hmm.
But they have tannins and other sorts of things that are known toxins, and they killed cats and dogs.
Mm-hmm.
So grapes are toxic to cats and dogs. So there are toxins in there, is what that means. It's just we have more of ability to break down those toxins. So we have a bit of defenses against some things. We do not have complete defenses against these things, though. And so that's something that's really important. And to your point, we would have started to adapt to some of these toxins. It would have really hurt us. We saw it very clearly in the fossil record. The height and health of the population declined sharply and immediately within a generation or two, just went down. We saw this in real time with the Native Americans and the Native Australians, where they were tall, robust, healthy in the 1800s, and then they got moved on to reservations, etc., and sort of started taking off their land. They couldn't hunt, they couldn't fish, they couldn't do all the things they normally did. They had to rely on more agricultural based foods, and they got sick and they didn't develop properly. There's a study called Tallest in the World. It was published in 2001, and it looked at original source data from the late 1800s, where they actually studied the Native Americans in the Great Plains, like the Cheyenne Indians, who were the tallest human beings alive on Earth at the time as a population. And they were a good 5-6 inches taller than the European Americans at the time, and Europeans in general. And the interesting part of that was that they found that the older generations, so like the grandparents and the great grandparents, they were by far the tallest out of all of them. And the the fathers and the just the men were significantly shorter as they went down the generations. And they said that if they did this study 100 years ago or 50 years ago, they would have the average height would have been far higher, would have been well over 6 feet. That study was done directly after, within a generation or two, after the bison were all wiped out, and they were taken off of their land. They weren't able to do big buffalo hunts every year and just eat meat all year and eat pemmican, which is high fat. It's like 80% calories from fat. So don't let anybody tell you that they're eating lean meat. It's not. They don't have marbling, but they have a lot of subcutaneous fat and they have a ton of abdominal fat. And they render all that out and mix it with the dried muscle, and that becomes pemmican. It's 2 to 1 grams of fat to protein. It's 80% calories from fat, and that's what they ate year round. And these were the tallest human beings alive on Earth. And then when they got put on reservations and they got taken away from their natural food and started eating more crop-based foods, They just shrunk. And we see that in the fossil record 10,000 years ago as well. So we have some ability to adapt, but there's only certain populations who have been exposed to agriculture 10,000 years ago. And we see it. So we see lactase persistence, right? Being able to break down lactose. Okay, when we became pastoralists and started domesticating animals and getting milk because we ran out of megafauna that had more fat. Now we needed more fat. So we sort of figured out how to make butter and cream and things like that. And we're like, okay, well, we need that fat. And lactase persistence shows up about 10, 12,000 years ago. And people say, well, we make amylase, which breaks down starches, plant carbohydrates, starch. But when did it happen? Right. Well, we're omnivores because we make amylase. But when did we start making amylase? It was about 10,000 years ago. And it spread quite rapidly because it was definitely a survival advantage when you're in an agricultural society. So all these things happened very recently, and we did have these adaptations, but then you also had these native populations who did not follow suit 10,000 years ago. I mean, agriculture sort of independently came up in 7 different points around the world independently. And then it was sort of spread through, just civilizations talking to each other. And that means that these more isolated populations that didn't have widespread agriculture, that didn't really come until sort of the European conquests of the Americas and Australia. I mean, they did have agricultural practices in certain areas, but you're talking about entire continents, so it's not like all the native people there were practicing this. It was very certain areas like Mesoamerica. So that one area on 2 continents were the main agricultural sort of centers, and there was sort of other centers as well, but those were the main ones. So a lot of these places did not do that. Either way, they've only been exposed to these things for 100 years, 150 years. So they actually get the same diseases that everybody else gets, the diabetes, heart disease, cancer, autoimmunity, but they get it at 4 or 5 times the rate. So they're much more genetically susceptible because they have not had that 10,000 year period of adaptation. And that 10,000 years of adaptation was clearly not long enough to make this impervious to these toxins, because we do get these diseases. We just get them at a much lower rate than the native populations that have not been exposed to this. I would also, just as an aside, I would also disagree with that premise in Sapiens, and just it's a very common old belief that this bettered society and civilization by turning to agriculture. I mean, we see in the fossil records it destroyed people's health and their life. And for 2 million years before that, we didn't bother with it at all. And so, was it really that much of an advantage? So we say that, well, society and civilization can't exist without that. That's not true, actually. We have countless examples of massive populations that were hunter-gatherer or even pastoralists that just relied on meat. And, the Native Americans are a good example of that in the Great Plains. They had enough animals around that they didn't actually have to turn to agriculture in most of those areas. Because there's over 100 million bison running around, and you just would get enough to feed your entire family and your tribe with one hunt a year. And so they didn't need to do that. And they absolutely had a civilization, a thriving civilization. There was some sort of disease that wiped out 95% of the population of North America in the early 1600s, right before the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. They were actually surprised. There's supposed to be a ton of people there, and there was no one there. And they're like, what the hell happened? So it was right sort of then. And after that, when they started sort of going west, because that was the only time you could go west because it was so densely populated. I mean, the 1500s, they said you could sail from the tip of Florida all the way up to Maine, and there would be massive fires and bonfires all the way up the eastern seaboard the entire way. And there were so many fires because there were so many people that you could smell wood smoke 200 miles out to sea, right? So there's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, gone. And they didn't know why. And so they started looking and exploring. And that's when that Western, sort of exploration started happening. And when they did, they went over and they found a city, an actual city, a ghost town city in what is now St. Louis, that had, buildings and, longhouses and things like that, that that they calculated could have housed up to 1 million full-time residents. And there were these massive trade routes that were like, they didn't have paved roads, but they were just walked up and down so frequently that just, they were, even now, years, decades after, people had even used these things, they were still just beaten into the ground, out in 5 different directions, going up to the Great Lakes, down south, out west and east and things like that. And so, you know, that was a society we don't know about because it got wiped out. There was an explorer that went through the Amazon jungle, which is actually a man-made jungle. Those are not indigenous plants. That was actually created and cultivated by the populations and kingdoms that were there at the time. Look it up. It's super interesting. They created this weird soil that has this weird microbiome that's completely man-made. And it's like this super soil. I mean, we have not been able to figure out how to replicate it, but you can sort of put it in other soil and make it, turn into awesome stuff. So there's an explorer, like, I think, what, 1500s ish, and he went up the Amazon, and he said there's just all these civilizations and kingdoms and buildings and temples and, pyramids and all these sorts of things and all these different people, and they traded with them all up and down and blah blah blah. 50 years later, people were going back through. They're like, oh, we should go up and check this out and check and make contact with these kingdoms, and it's just jungle. They didn't see anything. They didn't see any people. And they're like, oh, what the hell? This guy must have just been making up stories. Well, now they've started to uncover massive civilizations and temples and pyramids and things like that were actually there and actually were in the same spots and description of this guy. So probably what happened is they brought some diseases that these guys couldn't contend with and just wiped out the population and knocked them back into sort of a prehistoric civilization where they were just hunting together. They couldn't even maintain the civilization and the structures and technology that they had before that. Rome did that. When Rome collapsed in Europe, it knocked people back so far that it took 1,000 years to get back to the standard of living that people had in Europe under the Roman rule. It knocked them back so far, and they didn't even have the know-how and the human sort of capital to maintain the structures and buildings that the Romans had made, let alone make new ones and improve on them. And so that's probably what happened to these guys as well. But the best example would be the Mongols. Genghis Khan and the Mongol horde. They were carnivores and pastoralists. They did not grow crops. In fact, they wiped them out to, like, make grasslands for their horses and have wild game and things like that. And they ate horse meat, drank horse blood, fermented mare's milk, and they hunted. And that's how they lived. And their army would not just go up in a column, it would just be all spread out because they were all living off the land and hunting as they went as well. And then they'd all sort of,
I believe the Mongol horde had like 4.5 horses per individual in their
something like that. Yeah.
in their
4 or
retinue.
5. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was all cavalry. They had no time for infantry. Right. And so, they took over the largest contiguous empire that has ever existed in human history. And we called them barbarians. They were not. These were some of the most intelligent and educated people. They had such a profound respect for knowledge and innovation. Genghis Khan revolutionized warfare, and he took different sorts of tactics and technologies from different areas and then amalgamated them and turned them together and just became this massive war machine. And his grandson Kublai Khan, who ruled the kingdom at its height when it stretched from the Sea of Japan all the way to Eastern Europe and through the Middle East and everything like that. Kublai Khan, everyone thinks is like this barbarian warlord, this, that, and the other. He built 30,000 schools in China alone. They're building schools all over the place. They were, one of the, Thomas Sowell points this out, that when you have communication between societies, then you'll have technology grow at a very, very fast rate. So really what you need is communication. Really, you need multiple societies having a stream of communication. And he made it and Genghis Khan made it a point. It's like, you have to have these streams of communication, and all his descendants largely did that until they sort of collapsed after the Black Plague. But they got scholars and teachers from Europe and Middle East and everything like that, and China, and they mixed them all around and got people all over the place. We talk about like Marco Polo brought pasta back. He went to the courts of China and the emperors in China. No, he did not. He went to the Mongol court in China because they controlled China. They own China. And what is now China is actually a remnant of the old Mongol Empire, because China then was less than 1/5 the size of what is modern China. Modern China is actually the Mongol Empire, part of the Mongol Empire. And so um, the Khans actually brought China and the Middle East up into their industrial and economic heights. It was under them. We talk about like China back then was like, oh, they were so great. Even looking this in Thomas Sowell, he said that at one point they became very insular and they closed themselves off and all that sort. That was after the Black Plague, when they got the Khans started going a bit crazy, and they started being very anti-Chinese, and then they ended up leaving. The Chinese were like, yeah, never come back. We don't want you back again. That's when they sort of pulled into themselves, and they were like, wow, they were at the height of world industry and technology. That was not because of China. That was because of the Mongols that brought them to those heights, and they ate meat,
I
and they
believe
run the
after
largest contiguous empire.
I
Yeah.
believe after Genghis Khan died, he died, and then he had a group take him out somewhere random,
Mhm.
bury him, and then the group was coming back, and another group killed them on the way back, so they didn't know where they were, and then that second group was headed back, and a third group killed that group, so they don't actually have any idea where Genghis
I have no
Khan
idea.
was put, which is very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
With you mentioned the St. Louis. Was it the Cahokia Mounds? Is that the mounds in the St. Louis area? The Indian tribe, I believe. That's the big one out there. I'm from
Yeah.
St. Louis. I've been there.
Oh,
It's
okay.
amazing.
Nice.
It's. I've walked to the top of their mounds and their area. It is a huge, astounding achievement of like
Mm.
constructions. It's pretty impressive.
Nice.
Assuming somebody does eat a strict carnivore diet, they would be getting no carbs from their diet. Um, how would that implement towards like peak level performance? So if somebody said, "Hey, I want to be running marathons, I want to be performing like something fast, something that requires, or not necessarily requires, but glycogen is a more available source of fuel at that time," would you argue that they can perform as well, if not better, on a fat based
Oh, yeah.
diet?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you make all the carbohydrates you need, blood sugar, glycogen, etc. But now you actually have the added benefit of ketones. Doing carnivore, you may have noticed as well. I mean, this is sort of an aside, but um, when you get rid of all those plant toxins, inflammatory factors, like you just don't get sore anymore. So I can do a crazy heavy workout. Doesn't matter how long it's been since I've worked out. I just don't get sore. Doesn't matter how hard I go. Doesn't matter how long it's been. I don't get sore. And so imagine that as an athlete, when you're improving, when you're able to train so much more than other people, and you're not just crippled and hurting for that. So you can go out and train again, and you can train again, and you can train again. So your recovery is so much better. So your lead up to the competition is going to be much stronger, because you can do so much work, so much more work, and you can recover so much better. But just from an energy dynamic, this has just been a myth that has been perpetuated for a very long time. It's one of those ones that really didn't have any strong evidence behind it, but because it had a plausible sort of rationale, and no one had anything, a competing theory to challenge it, it just sort of took hold and became, the accepted dogma. More recently, that has been challenged, and it's been shown to be not the case. And in fact, low carb, zero carb athletes are showing themselves to be a much, much more dominant force. And they're also not getting sick. They're not getting diabetes and prediabetes, because that is what's happening to a lot of Ironman athletes, marathon runners, Tour de France athletes. I mean, these are the top athletes in the world, and yet they're metabolically sick. Their guts kill them. They're in horrible pain all the time, and they're pre-diabetic or diabetic. I mean, how is that going to help you in your longevity as an athlete? So many people are moving to this, and there's some of the top Ironman athletes in the world, some of the top ultra marathon runners in the world, and even the top cyclists. This guy Chris Froome, who's a multi Tour de France winner. he does a ketogenic diet, right? So that's one thing that people say, well, no one's on the Tour de France on a ketogenic diet. Like, no, the winner is, like one of the best in the world. So, one of the reasons that people get confused about this is because they talk about, you're in your fat burning state and you're sort of your VO2 max up to sort of 50, 60%. You're oxidizing fat. So this is your zone 2 cardio. So you want to get yourself up to that level, but don't go past that because then you're going to be burning carbs. And if you want to burn fat, then you stay in that zone. But if you work harder than that, then you'll switch to carbs. And so that is the major misconception is that people have, is that if you work harder than that certain level, you start burning carbs, and therefore you need carbs. A, you make carbs. B, that's not true. That's only true for carbohydrate fueled athletes. When we look at ketogenic athletes or just anybody in ketosis, and you look at fat oxidation, you actually are burning fat over 90% VO2 max. And so generally for any given workout, you will, or for like long distance, 3-hour run, 100-mile run, these sorts of things, you're burning 9% of your energy is coming from fat and 10% or so is coming from carbohydrates. And those are the carbohydrates you make, obviously, because they're not taking in carbohydrates. And so it does matter how long you've been in ketosis because your body utilizes ketones more effectively the longer you've had them available. So there's this epigenetic effect when you start using, if you haven't been using ketones largely for a long time, your body just sort of shuts down those processes that accept and use ketones because you're not using them. So you're adapting more to carbs. But then you switch over to ketosis and your body says, oh, okay, well, let's start using this as a fuel source now because it's actually our most of our tissues preferred fuel source. When you have ketones available or glycogen or glucose available, even if you have ample of both, most of your tissue will just run on the ketones if they're available. It's only when ketones aren't available that you will switch over to glucose. For most tissue, some tissue will still run on glucose, which is why we have glucose, which is why we make glucose. And but you make as much as you need. So when you get more keto adapted after a couple of weeks, it's usually back up to your baseline. But some studies have shown that it's minimum or maximum 6 weeks is what you need to get back up to your previous performance. But Professor Tim Noakes, who did this study that looked at, they gave them 6 weeks to get keto adapted. He said that they were basically all back up to their baseline by 3 weeks, and but they'd give them 6 weeks just in case. And they ran the hell out of them, and they found that the keto group performed just as well as the carb group after 6 weeks. And these are recreational athletes, sort of weekend warriors. And but then it was a randomized crossover trial. So they randomized people into the keto or carb group, and then they did a crossover. So they had a 2-week washout period where they just ate whatever the hell. And then the carb group became the keto group and vice versa. And they gave them another 6 weeks to keto adapt. And then they challenged them again. And again, no drop in their performance. So we know at least that you won't drop your performance after about 6 weeks. Now you get to 3 months with the McSweeney trial in 2018. They took world-class Ironman and ultramarathon athletes. They self-selected into keto or carb groups, and they challenged them with 3 major events. So it was a long distance thing, it was a sprint, and there was a critical power test, like a powerlifting sort of test. So it was a 100-mile run, 6-second sprint, and then the critical power lifting test, right? And the keto group at 3 months fat adaptation outperformed the carb group, and they were all elite athletes in all 3 events. The 100-mile run didn't come to statistical significance, so that's a trend, but they did all beat them, essentially. But the sprint and the critical power test did come to statistical significance. So this is a lot of times you'll see ultramarathon runners or Tour de France people or whatever, and they're doing this, and people say, well, yeah, okay, it works for them, it works for the distance guys, but if you're going to do an explosive game like rugby or powerlifting or something like that, like you're sprinting, like you need carbs, you just have to have carbs. Well, first of all, again, you make carbs, you have glycogen. and that's readily available, and that's been shown in another study I'll come to. But in fact, no, this study shows quite clearly that the keto group outperformed the carb group because your muscles actually can run on ketones. People don't understand that. They think our muscles have to have glycogen. They don't. And so the high performance, high explosive anaerobic exercises actually statistically significant improved with the ketogenic diet. The distance, they beat them, but it didn't quite reach statistical significance. So, we'll have to see what other studies come out with that. But, just in practice, it does that. But you can't argue on the critical power in the sprinting.
Traditionally, like you think like we're aerobic. When you're in your zone 2, you're burning fat, and then when you get into the anaerobic phase, that's when you're burning glycogen. That's the typical by thought process on that. So you're burning glycogen, and as a byproduct, you are getting the lactic acid when you're in that anaerobic state. Would you say, because you're right, we do produce our own glycogen, would we be able to recover as well and get, let's say we had like a multiple day event that was explosive, would we be able to recover as well just eating a carnivore diet versus like getting those carbs in, that glycogen directly in after?
So the thing is, you even with anaerobic, you'll still be running on ketones. You still
Okay.
run on fat oxidation. So again, you can up to 90% VO2 max. You're still burning fat, and you'll still make lactic acid. That's just a product of the anaerobic side of things, as opposed to the substrate that leads into it. Because ketones will turn into acetyl CoA that goes into the Krebs cycle. Glucose turns into acetyl CoA, which goes into the Krebs cycle. So it's just the direction is getting to acetyl CoA, and then after that, you have differences in aerobic, anaerobic sort of things, right? And so you will still run on fat oxidation, even on anaerobic, and that's what can be shown in that. But and that was what Professor Noakes actually showed, because they were saying that, like, well, these guys, they're in the keto group, they're just running on their glycogen stores, and so he's like, all right, well, let's test that. And so they did a series of exercises, basically 800-meter sprints, that that they just kept doing them and doing them and doing them and doing them and doing them until there's not gonna be any glycogen left in these guys.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they were still performing. And the carb group are sucking down gels and sugar packets, and the carb and the keto group are just going. And that's the thing. We know you're not going to drop your performance, and in some cases you can improve your performance. But but the main thing is that once you have access to your fat stores, because you're talking in zone 2, you're burning fat, and then after that when you're in ketosis, you're always burning fat. That's the definition of ketosis. It's not the ketones. The ketones are a product of fat burning. That's a downstream effect. So you are always burning fat when you're in ketosis, and sometimes some of that fat you're using to turn into carbohydrates and glycogen. You have these sort of triglycerides with sort of glycerin backbone. The glycerin backbone gets turned into carbohydrates, and then the fatty acids that are sort of off the glycerin, that gets turned into ketones. So you actually get both by burning fat automatically, right? And so it's but we know that we were running on ketones, and our muscles run on ketones even in anaerobic activity, and we even see this in glycogen storage diseases where people don't process glycogen properly. And I'm blanking on the name, but anyway, basically that's it. You don't make glycogen properly, and you can't run on it. And so people on a carbohydrate rich diet, their muscles just don't work properly, and they walk 50 feet and they are exhausted, and their muscles are just cramping up, and they're just so tired, and they just have to rest, and they have to like pretend to tie their shoe or do something like that, and catch their breath, and they do this, and but that's their life. They can't go very far. There's a case series that came out when some of these people started trying ketogenic diets, and they found that they had completely fixed their problems because now their muscles were running on ketones. And so they didn't actually have this problem. So that's published from Dr. Eric Westman, who's a professor at Duke University. He's been using ketogenic diets to treat patients for 25 years. Now in athletes, in top athletes, again, there was another study that I alluded to, which is a perfect segue for that, which is the Volek and Finney trial called the FASTER trial. And that was published in 2016. And that looked at, again, top level, world class ultra marathon and Ironman athletes, and they had already been doing whatever they've been doing, so they didn't like split them off, and it wasn't like an intervention. It was just they had a number of these guys that had stopped eating carbs, and they'd been doing ketogenic diets for at least 9 months, and some of them up to like 3 years. And but an average of 20 months. So these guys had already these are world-class athletes at that time, so they're world-class athletes in ketosis, right? So we already know that they're competing and they can compete because they are competing.
Mhm.
And what they did was they did a 3-hour run, just go for 3 hours, and they were looking at what energy fuel systems they were using, and they did the whole normal thing, like up to about 54% VO2 max in the carb group. That's where the fat oxidation peaked, and then it came down sharply after that. And it wasn't using too much. But then in the keto group, they're using much more of their energy was from fat oxidation and ketones, and far higher. So it went up to past 90% VO2 max. So big difference in their energy, but also the carb groups were sucking down gels, whereas the keto group was not. Why is that? Because they're running on their fat. That's the whole point. It's a fat burning state. And so you have access to your fat cells because when your insulin is elevated, it blocks lipolysis, which is the degradation of fat for energy. So when you eat carbohydrates, it raises your insulin, and now you have to keep eating carbs because you cannot access your fat stores. Whereas you're in ketosis, your insulin is low, and now you can access your fat stores. That is a much better fuel source. That is our primary fuel source and our most effective fuel source. Glycogen is a pretty poor storage form. It's a temporary storage form. It's just used there just for a bit, and then that's it. But fat is our long-term storage form. Glycogen, if you maximate for a 65 kilo individual, which is like 150 pounds, 155 pounds, 60 pounds, something like that. Elite athlete, 6% body fat. That 65 kilo individual with maximal glycogen storage in their liver and their muscles can maximally store about 2,400 kilocalories of energy. But that same 65 kilo individual with only 6% body fat, so lean, shredded little bastard, right? That 6% body fat on a 65 kilo individual contains over 35,000 kilocalories of energy. So it's 15 times the amount of energy on a very lean person. And so when you're in ketosis, you have access to that. And so you're constantly making blood sugar and glycogen again with that glycerol backbone, right? That's going to turn into carbs. And then the fatty tails are all going to turn into ketones, right? So when looked at the Volect Faster trial, they not only did they have them run for 3 hours, but what they did was they looked at the VO2 max. They looked at all the what energy sources they were using, and again they used over 90% of or about 90% of the energy came from fat oxidation versus carbs in the keto group, and much less in the carb group. But they also did muscle biopsies looking for muscle glycogen. So this is to answer your question from earlier. Well, do you recover, and are you going to get enough glycogen? Well, first of all, do you need it? Answer to that riddle is no. Your muscles can run on fat oxidation for anaerobic activity, and predominantly do until you get over 92% VO2 max. And not many people are doing that. And but either way, you're gonna have glycogen too, because they did muscle biopsies before the 3-hour run, directly afterwards, and then 3 hours after that, after their recovery, which is pretty rough. I mean, a muscle biopsy is not fun. They're just having a needle in your leg, taking a chunk of muscle out, and then telling them, all right, now hit the treadmill and go run for 3 hours, right? And so these guys said that it felt like there was someone stabbing them with a pen in their leg, like every step they took for 3 hours.
Jeez.
So absolute troopers for doing that. And then get stabbed twice more. So what they found was quite interesting. The carb group that was carb loading and all that sort of stuff had the exact same glycogen levels as the keto group who hadn't eaten carbs in, on average, 20 months, right?
Mhm.
And then directly after the 3-hour run, they again had very similar levels. In fact, the keto group was slightly above the carb group, very slightly. It was very similar. But then and the carb group were drinking gels and sugar packets and drinks and crap like that during it, and the keto group was not, right? So the carb group had slightly less muscle glycogen after the run, even though they'd been sucking down carbs. And the keto group is just making it themselves. So they're just replacing what they're using as they go. And then 3 hours after in the recovery, and again, the carb group is just taking down sugary gels and all that sort of garbage. Keto group's just hanging out. They again had the same recovery as well. So yes, absolutely. You do not need to eat carbohydrates to replenish your glycogen stores. In fact, it probably hinders you because you're now reliant on those carbs. Whereas if you just let your body do it yourself, it does it just as well as
Uh,
if you were sucking down gels. As well as again, you need to be keto adapted to get the best effects from this. There was a trial called the Supernova trial that a lot of people that try to argue the opposite side of the argument hang their hat on. It was a big study, and they looked at they said they look at top athletes, but let's be fair, these were speed walkers. And so I don't know if you can really call them athletes, but they did call them athletes for the purposes of this study. And so, and they put them on ketogenic diets, and they found, yeah, okay, fat oxidation goes way up. We see that, but performance went down. I don't know how you measure that with walking, but apparently you
mhm.
can. And so, like, um, yeah, I'm sorry to any speed walkers out there,
Yeah.
just joking around. But come on,
The only thing that comes to
play a
mind
real sport. But
whenever you say speed walking is I don't know if you've seen Malcolm in the Middle, but that episode of of how he gets
uh,
super into speed walking and has like
oh, yeah.
the full jumpsuit with like the helmet that like swoops back and you got
Oh,
to
that's
keep your
awesome.
one foot.
Yeah.
It's so I was
Um,
gonna say though, it does sound like it's all or nothing. Like to get the most
yeah.
benefits from either side, you either need to be consuming as an athlete like 600 grams of carbs during your training, or you need to be into no carbs, no consumed carbs on that aspect. It seems like if you are mainly carnivore and you eat some carbs, it would
Mhm.
hinder you overall and put you.
Yeah, it wouldn't allow you to fat adapt, and that's a major downfall that the supernova study actually points out, which is
Mhm.
or shows. Really, that's the only useful thing that came from the supernova trial was they never gave these guys time to fat adapt, and so they went from eating high amounts of carbohydrates to then say, okay, now you're ketogenic, and basically tested them within a week or two, and their performance went down. And it's like, oh, okay. So obviously, okay, yes, you're going through fat adaptation, but it doesn't matter what your metabolism is and you're burning fat, like you're not performing. And then we're interested in performance, and that's fair enough. But they also didn't give them a chance to fat adapt. It was only a couple weeks, and they also didn't account for the fact that when you go into a ketogenic diet and your insulin levels start coming down, you don't have these insulin spikes all the time, that you actually will start losing more sodium out of your kidneys in your urine as you would have before. Insulin affects 5 different points in your nephrons and the microtubules in your nephrons, and hold back in sodium. Right. So after years and years and years of dealing with insulin, your body is actually drawing out more sodium than it needs to offset the insulin, drawing it back in inappropriately because you start getting more and more insulin. Because again, a lot of these guys are pre-diabetic or diabetic because they're eating so many carbs to load up for their competitions. And so when you stop eating carbohydrates and your insulin sort of comes down, you're sort of pulling the rug out on your kidneys. And so now it's overcompensating for the insulin that's not there anymore. And for a period of time, it doesn't last long, but it does happen for many people. And especially when you're dealing with athletes, this can make a big difference. You'll lose too much sodium in particular. Sodium draws water. Wherever sodium goes, water follows passively. And so you end up getting dehydrated. You get hypovolemic. That can definitely affect your performance, negatively affect your performance. And so what you have to do is you have to take up to 5 to 7 grams of salt a day with more water in order to offset that in the first few weeks. Especially if you're symptomatic, like if you sort of stand up, you sort of get a bit lightheaded, that could be from hypovolemia, and because you're losing too much water and sodium. They didn't account for that. And so you have these athletes that are doing a competition, and they're likely, have electrolyte imbalances and dehydration as a result of that, and they're not keto adapted. So, really what that's showing is just, that you have to be careful early on in the adaptation period, or it can affect your performance and affect how you feel. In fact, there are many people that feel that the so-called keto flu that people get, where they feel pretty rubbish and lightheaded
Mhm.
and sort of feeling, gross and yucky, comes in large part from that hypovolemia and electrolyte imbalance. I think it's also going to be from withdrawals. You're definitely going to be
Mhm.
withdrawing from different substances, and we do see that as well. But certainly that can play a role also. So that just displays that if you're just sort of having some carbs and eating a lot of meat, you're never going to get keto adapted, and so you really are going to rely on those carbs for competition. Um, so, take that for what it is, but it's also the fact that within 2, 3 weeks, most people are back up to their normal competition state. For me, I didn't notice myself a drop in my performance. I felt fantastic right from the get-go. Um, and just felt better and better as I went. I've dealt with other athletes who are in mid-season, NCAA Division One, three-time All-American Brian Talbot, who became a three-time All-American after he went carnivore. He switched mid-season, and he said, sort of first 2 weeks he felt a bit off, but it didn't affect his performance. And then after 2 weeks, his performance just took off. And I see other people like that too. Some people have more of a teething period, and they sort of, it drops their performance. And so, if you're concerned about that and you're an athlete, maybe think about it when you have, there's a bye week, or there's a bit of a break, or in the off season or something like that. Or, I know a lot of people that say, nah, you know what, I just want to get into this, and they just do it, and
Yep.
they're fine with it. And taking care of electrolytes and water and all that sort of stuff, seems to be fine. So it and the thing is too, the longer you are in ketosis, the more keto adapted you are, and the better you're going to run on those ketones. So you do get added benefit not only after a couple of weeks, but after several months and even several years. And we're seeing exercise physiologists that study this saying that their athletes that they're tracking, they're seeing increased performance output after 2, 3 years on ketogenic diets and keto adapting. So it's very beneficial the longer you go. Also, when you're in ketosis and your insulin is low, insulin affects hundreds of different physiological you functions in your body, and they're really important. And so,
Mhm.
and you only get insulin resistance to carbohydrates. Really, like everything else is being affected at full force. So if your insulin is triple, quintuple, 10 times what it should be, which can happen, then it's going to be 5, 10 times what it should be for these other things. And now you're really going to get out of balance, and you're going to have trouble. And one of the things that insulin does is it blocks autophagy, which breaks down and recycles these old damaged cells,
Mhm.
precancerous cells, zombie cells. There's a lot of different names for them, but their cells have just been a bit broken down. Our body's in a constant state of regeneration and repair to keep us young, fit, and healthy as long as possible. And when those processes start to break down, we start to age more quickly, and we build up, metabolic diseases and chronic diseases and cancers and things like that. Not only do you break down the old damaged cells, but you can replace out the inner workings of the cells, the organelles inside the cells, and just replace. It's like replacing parts. Like if you have, a bad, a fan belt in your car, you don't just scrap the car and buy a new one. You just replace the damn fan belt, and everything else is fine. Or swap out a couple parts and replace the brakes and all that sort of stuff. It's just maintenance.
Mhm.
So this is normal maintenance. And people say, well, you need to starve yourself and fast for 5 days every 3 months in order to go through autophagy to get these benefits and this hack, these benefits of starving yourself to death. And I'm like, there's no benefits of starving to death. Sorry to break that to you. This is a normal housekeeping process that will happen no matter what, as long as your insulin is low at normal physiological levels. And so being in ketosis long term allows you to go through autophagy. and replace out the inner workings of the cell, like the mitochondria, is called mitophagy. And also, insulin suppresses stem cells and the regeneration of these cells and regeneration of these mitochondria and other organelles. And so, studies have shown that after 3 months on a ketogenic diet, that you'll have 4 times the number of mitochondria in your cells, and they're 4 times as effective. So there's this massive multiplication of physiological, benefit from that. And mitochondria are not only the powerhouses of the cell, they're not only generating the ATP and energy of the cell, the cellular currency, but they're actually running the cell. They're like a sailor on an old school sailing ship, where they're like running up the riggings and pulling the masts and changing things around and changing the course and direction, doing all these things. There's a lot of moving parts inside the cell, and the mitochondria do a lot of those. So they move on this cytoskeleton, this internal sort of structural lattice network inside the cell, and they sort of move up and down. They know where to go. And so you're going to this organelle and pumping out ATP so it can do this, and they tell it to do this and then do that and then do that. Or, as an analogy of Professor Chris Palmer at Harvard, who studies ketogenic diets for schizophrenia and major psychiatric disorders, and it works. Newsflash, sort of spoiler alert. He describes this as like workers in a factory, going up to different machines and turning them on and doing work with these machines. And that's a pretty good analogy. And so when they're going up to a receptor on the side of your cell and they're pumping out energy so that it can send a signal or stop sending a signal, or affect some other sort of change, then if it gets there a bit slower because they're a bit more decrepit or there's less of them, and it's harder for them to go through oxidative phosphorylation because they're damaged and junky, and the internal membrane is damaged, called crystallysis. That makes it harder for them to generate ATP, and they don't, So they get there a bit late, and they're not able to get all the energy out when they need to. And so it's the old saying, a day late and a dollar short. And so now you're getting these signals going off at the wrong times or stopping at the wrong times. You're getting misfiring in your brain, and this is how psychiatric conditions can manifest. And that's Professor Palmer's theory anyway. And so, as an athlete, the mitochondria again are the powerhouses of the cell, and so you have your cellular respiration and energy production massively increasing by increasing the number and the efficacy of your mitochondria inside your cells. It's going to have a huge benefit. Also, insulin blocks testosterone production in men and growth hormone production in men and women, or action in both men and women, and suppresses estrogen in women in particular. So, what happens as an athlete when you go onto a ketogenic carnivore diet? I'm seeing people, and if you're going full carnivore, not just keto, you're getting rid of all these plants that have all these hormonal disruptors as well, have all these phytoestrogens and things like that block testosterone, upregulate estrogen, or even act as estrogen, or block the estrogen receptor. So either way, you're getting imbalances, and you get massive hormonal increases. Ryan Talbot talks about his blood numbers. I see this every day in my practice. As I have people, I put them on carnivore diet for various reasons, and I track their blood work, and I see what happens, and I see all the time people's testosterone just going right up within a couple months. And going back to optimal levels for a 25-year-old. I have a 72-year-old man who tripled his testosterone levels to that of a healthy 25-year-old in about 4 months, 4 or 5 months. No medications, no TRT, anything like that. It was just pure diet and lifestyle. Exercise, anaerobic exercise, that increases testosterone growth hormone as well. Getting proper sleep, getting out in the sun, all these things can affect benefit as well. But so does the diet. And so Ryan Talbot, who's already, a scholarship athlete at Michigan State for, a D1 track scholarship, he massively ramped up his performance to the point that he actually switched to the decathlon that year. And in his second decathlon ever, he won the Big Ten championship, set a school record at Michigan State, and then was an All-American at the national trials. That was within 6 months of going carnivore. He got his blood tested. He said he wasn't really feeling well. He's a young guy. He was like 21, and he should be like a peak athlete. He was a peak athlete, but he didn't feel right. And he went to the team doctor and he said, "Hey, like, I'm not feeling good. I don't know what's going on. Can you check me out?" Did a whole bunch of blood panels, checked his testosterone. He's like, "Yeah, look, everything's fine. I don't see him." He's like, "Well, I don't feel fine. So obviously there's something going on that you can't tell me." And he contacted me on Instagram, and we chatted and sort of gave him some advice on how to do it. And he did. And he's been doing great since then. He's still doing it. He represented the US in the Pan Am Games. He got bronze in the Pan Am Games, just missed out on the Olympics, and he's still pursuing track. He's absolutely killing it. And he checked his testosterone level the next year, and his testosterone level went from 760 to 1150 the next year, right? And
Yeah.
so he was saying that, like, we had to figure out, first of all, he was losing a lot of weight, and he's just like, "Oh, I can't keep my weight on." And I was just like, "Well, you need to eat more. We need to find more times that you can eat, because you're training like a madman, and you're just not getting enough food." And then we figured out when to get him extra meals and this, that, and the other. And then he started having a problem. He's like, "Yeah, I have to actually pull back on my training because I'm actually putting on too much muscle. I'm getting like too bulky and too ripped." He's like, "I need to keep lighter than this,"
Yeah.
So it was like pretty good problem to have as an
Yeah.
athlete. And then the next year, his testosterone was doubled, right? Nearly doubled. And tell me that that's not a performance advantage for any male athlete, is having doubling your testosterone when you're about. And I have a rugby buddy of mine who's a professional rugby player here in America, U.S. National team player, and plays in the U.S. Major League Rugby. And he his testosterone went up even more. His went up from like 550 up to like 1100, over 1100 as well. So his like more than doubled.
Mhm.
And so this is a massive performance advantage. You also get advantages from just being well and not being sick. There's a guy, Brandon Lasciavo, who's a two-time Olympian for America. He's a two-time for diving. He was a high diver, and he was saying, before he went, more animal-based carnivore, mostly carnivore. He thinks has a couple other things as well, but he he had horrible IBS, to the point that he would have to take like an entire pack of Imodium to not have a problem at the pool during competitions and things like that. And he would just be like going up, and you're twisting and turning and doing all sorts of stuff, and your gut's just in knots, and it's painful, and
Yeah.
you're bloated, and you're like trying not to like have an accident and things like that, because you have such bad IBS. That's right there is going to really screw up your performance, and distract you from just doing your job. So you're going to be healthier. You're going to have better recovery. You're not going to get sore. You're going to have better access to energy. You're going to have 15, 20 times the amount of energy, because you're accessing your fat stores. And not all of us are 6% body fat, and so you're going to have massive increases in energy accessibility without having to take down a bunch of carbohydrates. You're going to improve your testosterone. You're going to improve your hormones and optimize those. You're also going to um, from a longevity point of view, you're also going to protect your joints, because we look at damaged cartilage in the articular surfaces of knees and shoulders and elbows and things like that, and even discs in the back. You have degenerative spines, degenerative discs in the back, and people have taken those, or scraped these things out of there, and got this sort of crud out of there, and taken it to the lab and say, okay, well, what's going on here? Why is this breaking down? They find that they're damaged by sugar. It's called glycation. You find these advanced glycation end products. Glucose and all carbohydrates will physically fuse to other molecules and permanently damage them. And they get this buildup of damage, and you get dysfunction, and organ dysfunction, tissue dysfunction. And and you can see that in arthritis in your joints. And so if you're carb loading and taking in all these carbohydrates so that you can perform at a peak level, you're not only giving yourself prediabetes and diabetes and metabolic syndrome and gut issues and IBS and Crohn's and things like that, but you're also damaging your joints. and your body is your tool. If you as an athlete, like, your body has to be working properly, and as that starts breaking down, then you can't perform anymore. I mean, I know I damaged my cartilage doing kickboxing, doing knee strikes. I didn't know this at the time, but apparently it's really bad for your cartilage on your kneecaps. And now I've got, bone on bone arthritis on that. But that started when I was 14 years old. And I had no idea that was happening. And this is a very common issue with people that have trained in fighting. And the rest of my body's perfect. It's like my doctor actually told me my knees are pristine other than that. And I feel great. And so I would be out there playing right now if it wasn't for the fact that my knee swells up every time I try to run. It's really annoying. But that's the thing. Like, I feel great. I could be competing, and my joint stops me.
Mm-hmm.
It stops me from being able to do that. And so as longevity as an athlete, like, you need your joints, right? So eating carbohydrates destroys your joints, destroys your back, destroys your discs. And so that's, from longevity perspective, that's a really bad idea. And also, there's life after sports, and you don't want to be a crippled mess that can't walk and can't move properly, right? You also, it's much, people talking about NAD plus, which is like for longevity and energy and all that sort of stuff. Well, we talked about, turning ketones into acetyl CoA and glucose into acetyl CoA, and then that going through the Krebs cycle to make ATP. It requires NAD plus to um, to turn ketones and glucose into acetyl CoA. It takes 4 NAD plus molecules to turn glucose into 2 acetyl CoA molecules. It only takes 1 NAD plus to convert ketones into 2 acetyl CoA molecules. So for the exact same ATP energy production, you use 1/4 of the NAD.
Let's
And
say
so, yeah.
let's say person's listening to this. I'm convinced. I'm ready to get going.
Mhm.
What would they do? Just go start buying ground beef, some steaks, fattier ground beef, 80/20. I'm assuming they're no longer going to have to supplement with creatine. You're eating a lot of skeletal
Mhm.
meat. Would they have to supplement with magnesium, omega-3s, anything like that to get the maximum benefits?
Not typically. I mean, you're going to improve all of that. The likelihood is that you're low on all that stuff anyway, because plants have anti-nutrients, and coffee is a particularly bad actor. Caffeine as well. Caffeine itself will just strip out magnesium out of your bloodstream. So most people are a bit low, and this is hidden by the reference ranges, because reference ranges at labs are just the average for the community, and because the average person in the community is eating 75 to 80% of their calories from plants, and most people will be drinking coffee, you're going to skew those reference ranges down below what is actually an optimal reference range.
Mhm.
So most people are low on different vitamins and minerals without even realizing it. Um, so in that sense, most people are going to be lower than optimal, but they might still be in the reference range. But when you get rid of those plants and those anti-nutrients, and especially if you are able to get rid of coffee and caffeine, which can be hard for some people, um, you will just start seeing these things come up and improving. Certainly the omega-3s, I mean, the DHA and EPA, they only exist in animal fat. It's mostly going to be from grass-fed and finished animal fat, but grass-fed butter will have it. Wild-caught fish will have it. Grass-fed tallow, if you cook with that or use that and mix that in, it will have it. If you get fat trimmings from the butcher that is grass-finished fat trimmings that have a bit of a yellow tint to it, or even dark yellow, that means it's definitely been eating grass up until the day it was slaughtered. That's going to be the best sources of DHA and EPA, those omega-3s. Um, Creatine, if you eat about 2 pounds of red meat a day, you'll get about 5 grams of creatine, which is the typical dose that
That's the
people
dose. Yeah.
take, and like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
this is really good. Well, it's because we're supposed to be eating about 5 pounds of meat or 2 pounds of meat a day. And so you should be just getting that amount of creatine anyway. Now, if you're not eating that much, is a little bit more going to be helpful to you. Maybe. I mean, I don't take creatine. I don't feel that I need it. I do eat 2 pounds or more of red meat a day. And so I'm definitely getting more, more than enough creatine. But, I think that's completely individual. If people, I mean, see how you feel, and just go with it. And then if you add in, some creatine, and you feel that adds a benefit, go for it. I mean, I remember when creatine first came out, I was a late teenager and I started taking it. I felt absolutely no different with
Mm.
that. I didn't see any performance advantage. I didn't see anything improving in the gym or my weights or, my results or anything like that. But looking back, I ate an ass ton of meat all
Yeah.
the time. I mean, I wasn't deficient in creatine. And so it may be that those benefits of taking creatine are really seen in the population that has it's deficient in their diet. It was not deficient in my diet, and so maybe that's why I didn't see much of a difference. But if you don't need to you don't need to supplement with anything. It is a complete diet. It is a perfectly balanced diet in the sense that it is perfectly balanced vitamins, minerals, nutrients that you need. All the nutrients that you need in the proportion that you need them come from eating that. Even just skeletal meat, you don't necessarily have to eat organ meat unless you have some sort of inability to process nutrients properly, or you have a malabsorption issue, or you have MTHFR or some other sort of methylating issue where you just need a bit more of these B vitamins, right? So in that case, a couple ounces of liver a few days a week generally just does the job. Or if you're coming from a really deficient state, which most people are, then adding in a bit of liver and a couple other organs, a couple ounces a day
Mm.
of liver, kidney, and heart goes a long way. And you can do that for a couple weeks and then cut back to 3 days a week, just a couple ounces. I mean, we're talking like 2, 3 mouthfuls of these things. It doesn't have to
Mm.
be like a whole plate of liver or anything, like that. So it's but most people are going to be deficient,
What
when they
about
start or low.
quality salt? Any kind of salt?
At first, probably advisable, especially
Mm.
if you're an athlete. Make sure that you are getting enough salt, especially if you are getting lightheaded when you stand up, or just sort of feel off. You're not having as good of a performance. Then keep that in mind that you could be spilling out too many electrolytes and water with it. And as such, you just want to add in some of like the mind, you know dried up sea salt, or
Mm-hmm.
the Celtic sea salt, things like that. The main things you want to avoid with salt is you don't want iodized salt, and you don't want any added ingredients to salt. They add in some weird anti-caking agents to sort of make so it doesn't clump together. Clumps are fine. Don't worry about clumps. You shake the damn bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Clumps go away. But those anti-caking agents are endocrine disruptors. They screw with your hormones, and they will make you more estrogen dominant, and they will block testosterone and things like that. So they will, and other ones will do other things, but they're endocrine disruptors anyway. And so you want to make sure that you look on and it's really weird that you have to check the ingredients label on salt, but you do. And if
Mm-hmm.
the ingredients say anything except salt, or possibly salt, comma iodine, don't get it. Just don't get it. Because if it has any sort of weird chemical name, or it says anti-caking agents, then those are those endocrine disruptors. So that's the main thing with salt. And then 5 to 7 grams, possibly. Typically, most people salting to taste is enough. But if you find that you're having some issues, or dizzy when you stand up and things like that, aim for that 5 to 7 grams. But usually that's only the first few weeks that people have that issue.
My wife is a first year MD PhD student out here in CU.
Nice.
So she's in the program.
Awesome.
She gets a lot of flack feedback, particularly for the way that we eat, the way that I eat. Why do you feel like the medical community is still so unwilling to change or revise?
It depends. It depends on the person. It depends on who you ask. And it depends on who's coming from. Like your wife is a first year student. Like, she's the lowest of the low.
Yeah.
And when she graduates medical school, she's going to be above medical students, but she's going to be the lowest of the low in the hospital. She's going to be an intern and just
Mm-hmm.
spat upon. I mean, nurses are going to trash her. So like it's just it has to do with that hierarchy. I mean, she's there to learn. The professors don't necessarily think there's anything that they can learn from their students. They're there to teach, and obviously they know everything. That's why they're in a professorship position. And so your wife is there going, oh, I do this some different. Oh gosh. Oh, you silly thing. Because like they're in a position of authority. when I work with people, when we're doing like a joint case in surgery or something like that, and they sound like, ah, so I heard about, this, that, and the other, whatever. We were just talking about it. We're doing this as colleagues and as sort of as equals, and then maybe they're very skeptical, but I'm easily in the best shape out of any doctor in that hospital. So it's like, at first they're like, well, that's crazy, but oh, I mean, it's doing something right. So, there's something going on there, but then you talk about it, and this is scientifically backed. This is, this is evidence based. And doctors respond to that. I mean, we're trained to be evidence based, but we're sort of trained in the wrong direction. We're trained, to be pharmaceutical pushers and things like that, and we just sort of regurgitate information that we've been told. Um, but there is that sort of background. Was like, hey, if there's evidence there, we should change the way we practice medicine. And and so when you talk to people like that and you show them the evidence, you answer all their questions. Okay, well, what about cholesterol? And what about fiber? And what about this? And what about that? Are you getting all your nutrients? And also, and you have the answers and references for that. And you go like, damn it, yeah, this is all making sense. And so I find that doctors are actually the easiest ones to convince, because they actually have the knowledge base for this to really make sense to them. It's just putting it in front of them in a way that makes sense to them and clicks home, and being in a position that they'll actually listen to you in the first place. If they're just like just a lowly medical student, like, oh gosh,
Yeah.
they're not going to do it. But there will be people that listen as well, and especially when you know her results are going to speak for themselves. She's going to be very healthy. She's going to have less burnout. She's going to be able to study more and get more out of it. Everyone else is going to be out of it and brain foggy and all screwed up and sleep deprived. She's going to be killing it.
Yeah.
She's going to be doing way better than her peers. And her peers are going to start taking notice, and they're going to start doing it too. And then her professors might as well. If you're down in St. Louis, you can look up, Dr. Gurpreet Pada, who's an anesthetist and a uh, pain management specialist. He's at St. Louis. I believe he's at Washington University at St. Louis, and he does carnivore, and he does carnivore for his patients because he says that it's one of the best things for chronic pain patients. And so he has his issues with his colleagues are that they're like, yeah, you're working too hard. You're spending like 45 minutes counseling someone on how to eat and what to do. Just, bang in a spinal cord stimulator and, and bank in, $5,000 and call it a day. Like, what are you doing? Like, why are you working so hard for less money? You're spending, twice the time counseling somebody, and you're just getting paid for an office visit instead of procedures. Procedures pay the bills,
Mhm.
you know? And they're very costly, and insurance covers them. And so it's like, why wouldn't you do it? Just do it. Just bang
Yeah.
in a pain, nerve stimulator and call it a day. Well, if you don't need to do that, then obviously it's part of our Hippocratic oath. It is incumbent upon us to do that first. And if that doesn't work, then you go to the nerve stimulator, things like that, spinal cord stimulator. But there are people around, and the thing is there are more and more doctors and clinicians that are discovering this and seeing that this works for their patients, either from their colleagues that are doing this and showing them the evidence of it, or their patients. Oftentimes it comes from patients. Their patients come in and they have this miraculous recovery, and they're like, how did this happen? And they show them like, look, this is what I did. I just changed the way I ate, and it massively improved my health. Now there's some people that are, and there's some people that are very open to that. My mom's doctor was gobsmacked when she walked in and dropped her HbA1c from 8.9 down to 6.1 in 2 months. And as she was coming off medications, and she was like, how the hell did you do this? You just reversed your diabetes. No one does that. That doesn't happen. This is a chronic disease. It only gets worse. How the hell did you do this? What the hell did you do? And she explained, all the carnivore stuff to her, and, my theories on the subject and the research I was doing. And she was like, I'd really like to learn more about this and take a look at his research. And so I went in and talked to her for like an hour and a half, and she was like, this is fantastic. And she was no slouch. She was an MD PhD out of Harvard. She had a PhD in biochemistry from Harvard. And I was talking to her, I was like, look, we're looking at biochemistry all wrong. You know, it's this ketogenic state. This is where all of our heavy machinery comes to bear. And from a physiological standpoint, from a medical standpoint, you're getting all these benefits. And she's like, you know, this is, you know, and she knew everything to look at that. And you look at that from that point of view and that reference, you just go like, that makes sense. And it all sort of slots in. And then you get the other side of it. I had a patient, um, you know, late last year, and she had multiple sclerosis. And she was extremely unwell. She had a very serious neurological dysfunction. And she was seeing a neurologist and she was on medications, but she hated the medication. She didn't feel good on them. It had all these different side effects. She was sick all the time. So it's an immune suppressant. And she came across Carnivore, and she had been coming to, you know, uh, our clinic, and she was feeling great. And she started improving symptomatically and started getting better and better. She's like, I don't want to take this damn medication anymore. And so she went to her neurologist and said, I want to come off the medication. I want to just address this just with diet. You know, a lot of people are doing this, and I think, it's working for me, and I want to do it. He berated her and said this was a terrible idea. She was going to kill herself. She was going to wind up in a wheelchair, and then she was going to die. And she had to keep taking her medication. And she ended up leaving there in tears, but it made her more determined to not listen to him. And so she came off her medication, had already come off her medication. And then, you know, 8 months later, she was due for another MRI. And she got her MRI. Not only did she improve symptomatically and how, you know, her daily life went, but the MRI actually showed that the lesions had shrunk down 40%, which does not happen. I have not been able to find that anywhere in the literature that that's ever happened, even in a case report.
Mhm.
And her doctor, her neurologist, said, I have no idea how this happened. I don't know how it happened. I don't know why it happened. I can't explain how it happened. I've never seen this before. I've never heard of this before. This should never happen. This only gets worse. And he's like, you know, especially because you came off your medication, I can't explain this. And she said, well, the only other difference is this carnivore diet I'm doing. Do you think that might have something to do with it? Absolutely not. Like, all right. So then you get those people who are just, you know, who are just willfully,
Yeah.
keeping themselves in the dark. And, life's going to pass them by, you know, they're going to be left behind. They're going to be behind the times. And if they don't shape up, they're going to lose their practice because people are not going to go to them. People are going to go to the doctors that can get them better, not the ones that are going to perpetuate illness. And that's fine. You know, we don't need them anyway. So I think that it's been very reassuring. I'm seeing more and more people reaching out to me on LinkedIn and other venues saying, hey, I've been a doctor for 30 years and I've been seeing this, and like this all makes sense. I've changed my practice. Now I'm actually helping people. I was burnt out. I was ready to retire and just get out of this.
Mhm.
But now I've revitalized my passion for medicine and for helping people, because I can actually help people now. I'm not just watching them deteriorate and get worse. I'm getting worse too. And, it's all getting, going downhill. And so now they're really happy and they're working again, all these sorts of things. So I think it's moving in the right direction. Um, the problem is that the food and drug companies have a stranglehold on medical education. They they dictate the curriculum in medical schools and in residencies. It's all pharmaceutical and procedural based. So here's a problem, here's a pill, here's a surgery. That's how medicine is taught right now.
Mhm.
And gone are the days of understanding how the physiology of the body worked to try to fix the system. You read medical textbooks from the 1800s, like Sir William Osler, who was the first professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins. He was considered the greatest medical educator of all time. Many conditions are named after him, like Osler's nodes on your hands and things like that. Um, he a friend of mine pointed this out. He did a Instagram post. But then I actually had of a textbook that Osler wrote, and I actually have this textbook. It was my great grandfather's, who was a doctor, Columbia trained doctor, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Well, he graduated from Columbia in early 1890s, and And in that, there's a section on diabetes, how you treat diabetes. This is before insulin was discovered.
Mhm.
I was like, what do? You eliminate carbohydrates. You eat this many grams of protein, this many grams of fat, and you cut out all these plants and carbohydrates. That was the treatment, right? For type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And now then we have insulin. Now it's a product. Don't worry about what you're eating. You don't have to limit carbohydrates. This is the American Diabetes Association official stance, is that you don't need to restrict carbohydrates. Just make sure you dose your insulin accordingly. And that would be fine if the only issue was blood sugar control. But as I said earlier, insulin affects hundreds of different processes in your body and your brain. And so if you're using more and more insulin to get your blood sugar down because you're eating more and more carbs, then you're actually causing serious physiological harm and dysfunction. So that's a problem. And so instead of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, which is what we did for 140 years before we discovered insulin, now it's just, oh, just give them more insulin. And now that's a product and that you can sell and you can make money on. And so now the advice is don't carb restrict, just give more insulin, like it's free or something,
Yeah.
And so, well, when you eat more carbohydrates, you have to take more insulin. They get to sell more insulin. And now
Right.
you have medications that are not designed to cure, they're designed to manage. And so you get people with a disease or with a condition, you never try to cure it. You try to reduce the symptoms enough that they can live with the disease for the rest of their life. And that's not me saying it, that's Goldman Sachs saying it. They had some leaked papers where they said, is curing someone of a disease a sustainable business model? The answer, of course, was no, because if you cure someone of a disease, then you treat them once and that's it, you know. And you killed the goose that laid the golden egg, right?
Mhm.
And so instead of having this return customer with perpetual income, basically turning people into slaves and serfs and indentured servants, where they're just there to churn and generate money for you, all of a sudden they're just off in the world running their own lives, and that's bullshit. Can't have
Yeah.
that. There's a pharmaceutical company called Gilead that when I was an intern back in 2013, they came up with a treatment for hepatitis C that actually cured hepatitis C. And so I was like, wow, that's really great. These guys are doing good work. I should keep an eye on Gilead. They've done worse things since then, but probably because of this, Goldman Sachs wrote them a missive basically telling them they messed up and just said, you should never have done that. You never cure a disease because now you can't sell them any other products. Now that disease is gone, and that's a wasted cash source, right? So what you do is you just come up with ways to treat the illness so that you can sell it to them for their entire life. And I'm sure that there was a sort of an implied sentiment there that, if they wanted investment money, from Goldman Sachs and places like that, that's the business model that they needed to go for. So, those are who are funding the universities. Those are who are funding the research and the professors who are teaching the medical students. Those are people that are writing the curriculums. Those are the people that are managing the residency programs. Those are the major funders of all the top conferences. When you go to
Mhm.
a major, neurosurgical conference or GI conference or, whatever conference, you're going to see all the sponsors. It's Pfizer, it's Merck, it's Nestle, it's Coca-Cola, it's all this other bullshit. And, the Nutrition Diabetics Association of America, the ADA, their main donors are all the processed food and sugar companies. That's terrible. That's obviously a conflict of
Mhm.
interest. And the nutritionists, the American Dietetics Association, the Australian Dietetics Association, they're all major sponsors. All their major sponsors are the processed food and cereal companies. You know, what do you think their advice is going to be? It's going to be that processed food and cereal and plant-based is all great. Sugar's not that bad. Oh, come on. It's just an empty calorie, just calories in, calories out, all that sort of
Mhm.
bullshit. Not that this is a hormonally disrupting substance that is neurotoxic and addictive in the same way that cocaine, heroin, and meth are. No, it's just an empty calorie. And just make sure you calorie count. Then you'll be fine. So that's what we're dealing with. And that's why most doctors don't understand this, is because it's being kept from us. It
Mhm.
is, when you're going through medical school, you don't have enough time in your day to go outside of that. You just there's a lot of stuff that you've got to cover, and so you're just trying to just sort of be accountable for the information that's in front of you, and you just sort of assume that you wouldn't be taught this stuff if it wasn't the best available information
Mhm.
and the best available research by the best available researchers. You make that assumption, and so this is why people say, "Well, I learned that in medical school. In medical school, it says this, and therefore it's that." You know, except that my one of my professors said that by the time we graduated medical, this was in the first year. By the time we graduated medical school, that everything we had learned in medical school would be obsolete.
Mhm.
And so you had to do your own investigation and stay current on the literature and look through and investigate for yourself and make your own decisions. That was a similar sentiment which was like a 1930s address to the graduating class at Harvard Medical School by one of the deans. And he said, just so you guys know, half of the things that you learned here at Harvard are going to turn out to be wrong, but no one's gonna tell you which half because nobody knows. You're just gonna have to figure that out yourself. But, we're all doing the best we can, and we're
Yeah.
learning as we go, and half the stuff you learned is wrong. So just keep that in mind, right? And a lot of people don't think about that and don't realize that, but it is true.
Yeah. I think it's pretty obvious and pretty naive to think otherwise in terms of like America's sick. And if you're going to a doctor, it's not that the doctor doesn't want to help you, but they are put in a position, a machine that's made money, that is taught to them a certain way to continue to make that machine money. And if you're going to the doctor to get better outside of like a very acute, very specific injury, like an
Mhm.
injured shoulder, injured knee, you're not setting yourself up for success, not because the doctor's out to get you. It's just that's just how the machine is set up. And it's really unfortunate. And the best way to combat that, obviously, it doesn't matter. I lean more towards animal based from what I've been able to consume and research, but it's pretty obvious that even just getting off of any kind of processed foods is going to help you right out of the gate.
Mhm. Yeah, I think so, and, I mean, I think that eating meat is beneficial. You're getting all these nutrients, vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, and proteins that are all bioavailable and in the right proportion to our particular demands. And all life has particular demands, and this meets ours. Um, and when you're eating more meat, you're getting more nutrients, but you're also replacing out those things that aren't necessarily as good for you, that don't confer as much benefit to you. And so that's just going to be better. Also, when you're making those decisions, and you're making very purposeful, intentional dietary choices, it's it is the case that you will likely make other conscious and beneficial dietary choices, such as cut out processed crap and refined sugar, start drinking less, things like that. Maybe stop smoking. Maybe do other things that are beneficial as well. So you're going to have a compounding effect, and the more meat you eat is going to benefit you from a nutrition standpoint. And the more meat you eat, the less of the other crap you're going to eat too, which is going to be very good because meat is good. It benefits you because it has nutrients that you need and want, but you want to avoid the other things because those other things cause harm. They have chemical compounds in them by the thousands that can cause harms. The plant kingdom as a whole makes about 1 million different defensive chemicals that are designed to protect them against predation. So they will kill, injure, upset, or damage the animals eating them. So just eating more meat and less of that crap is definitely of benefit. And as you keep going, you just get more and more in that direction. Maybe now you cut out carbs, you can go ketogenic, and wow, okay, now you're getting that metabolic state of ketosis. You're getting these massive metabolic benefits because your insulin is at a normal level. You're going to keep improving, and maybe you try cutting a bit more out and a bit more out, and then eventually maybe you do what I did and just say, okay, well, I'm just going to get rid of this. I'm just eating greens and meat, and but I know that these things have toxins in them, so maybe I just stop all of them. I'm not going to eat them at all. That last little bit, that last 5%, that can make 95% of the difference. And so, you're going to get improvements all the way. But, when you're ready and you want to try just 30 days of just meat, eggs, and water, you're going to see a massive, massive improvement on top of all the benefits that you already had.
It's extremely satiating as well. I train
It
twice
is,
a day right now. I eat twice a day. Like I eat 7 a.m. and then my last meal is usually at 3 p.m. and then I'm good to go. So it is extremely satiating. You don't feel the need to snack. You don't feel the need to have all these other things in the house as well, which is good. Well, Dr. Anthony, it has been a pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate your time coming out here. And let me pick your brain. I do have a tradition on this podcast where I ask the guests who would be the person that they would be most interested in speaking or listening to somebody else interview, assuming they're live and well. And if I do ever get them on the podcast, I'll of course credit them to you. Who would that person be for you?
Oh, I would. Well, I'll give you two because one is
Me
really
too.
unlikely. It's Thomas Sowell. Yeah, I absolutely love Thomas Sowell. He's just brilliant. Sowell. He's amazing. If you haven't come across his work, you should definitely start reading it. He's just amazing. He's got a ton of talks and lectures and debates and things like that online going back decades. But his written work is just astounding. His columns, he's written probably over 30,000 columns over the decades, and they're very, very interesting on every topic you can think of. He's an economist and a historian, social philosopher. Delves into politics and culture and sort of all these different sorts of things. Super interesting guy, extremely brilliant. And I truly believe that he's the most brilliant and well-developed thinker that America has ever produced. He's just absolutely incredible. So that would be a number one. But he doesn't really do interviews anymore. He's sort of, just sort of separate himself off. He's in his 90s and he's just sort of world weary at this point.
I'm sure.
And I understand why. And then it would be Victor Davis Hanson, who's actually a colleague of his at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. They're both senior fellows in their respective field. And but he's fantastic too. He's extremely erudite and interesting, and he has he's a classicist and a military historian, and I've read several of his books that are very, very interesting as well. So both of those guys are fantastic.
Okay. I will do my best. They sound like amazing people, and even if I can't speak with them, I'd love to learn from them and read what they have.
If you get a hold of Thomas Sowell, let me know, because that would be a dream to talk to that guy. If I could convince him to go carnivore and just like improve his health and get another like 20 years of good health, like that would just be a dream come true, So get like another 20 years of him in the world, it would be just amazing.
I would. Well, sir, where can people find you? Where can they get more from you?
I have a YouTube channel. It's just my name, Anthony Chaffee, MD, and CHAFFEE. And my Instagram is the same. And I have a podcast that's called The Plant Free MD, and that can be found sort of anywhere as well. And I have other social media, but they can all be found through those sources or just my name.
Awesome. Well, I subscribe to the podcast. It's a good one. I'm a big fan of this.
Thanks. And I just started a website too. It's called thecarnivorelife.com. And that has a lot of resources and links to videos and things like that, but also resources to different research papers and videos and things like that too. So I sort of don't remember that I have that up yet because it's only been up for a little bit.
New. Alrighty, sir. Well, I appreciate your time again today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Chase Merrill podcast.